2 American warships sailed straight through the waterway Iran said was closed. No warning shots, no Iranian response. Just silence. The world's most critical oil corridor. 20% of global energy supply was supposed to be under Iranian control, but something broke that control completely. And the story behind how it broke involves secret negotiations, a diplomatic humiliation, destroyed weapons, and a covert Chinese weapons shipment that American intelligence is tracking right now. The next 10 days will determine whether this ends at a table or whether it ends in fire. Welcome to WW3 Global Report, where the strategy behind the headlines is always the real story. Now, before we go any further, if you are someone who has lived long enough to remember when the world made sense, who reads the news and thinks something bigger is happening here, hit that subscribe button. Think of it as saving your seat. Before this briefing room fills up, and tell us in the comments, which country are you watching from today? Because this story affects every single one of you. Let's begin. On the morning of April 11th, 2 American warships moved through one of the most dangerous stretches of water on the planet. They did not hide. They did not slow down. Their tracking signals were fully active, visible to anyone watching. They sailed directly through the Strait of Hormuz, the very waterway that Iran had declared off limits to any vessel without its explicit permission. And as those 2 destroyers cut through the water in broad daylight, something remarkable happened. Iran did nothing. To understand why that silence was so significant, one must first understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually means to the world. It is a narrow passage of water sitting between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. At its narrowest point, it is only about 33 kilometers wide. Yet through that small corridor, roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil passes every single day. Approximately 11% of the world's liquefied natural gas moves through it as well. Analysts have long described it as the jugular vein of the global economy. If that passage closes, the entire world feels it within days. 6 weeks before those destroyers made their transit, Iran decided to use that geography as a weapon. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air campaign against Iran. Within days of the conflict beginning, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued formal warnings. They declared that no ship would be permitted to pass through the Strait of Hormuz without first receiving direct authorization from Iranian military contact points. The message was clear. Iran was claiming ownership of the world's most important waterway. The response from the global shipping industry was immediate. Major firms suspended their operations. Before the warnings, more than 130 ships per day were passing through the strait. After the IRGC's declaration and a confirmed 21 attacks on merchant vessels, that number collapsed to nearly 0. The strait went quiet. And sitting inside the Gulf, unable to exit, were approximately 230 fully loaded oil tankers trapped and waiting. The financial consequences spread across the globe almost instantly. Brent crude oil prices jumped between 10 and 13% in early trading. Analysts began warning that prices could reach $100 per barrel or higher if the disruption continued. Fertilizer shipments stalled. The cost of agricultural inputs began to rise. Nations that depend on Gulf energy exports started watching their economic forecasts darken. Iran had also claimed something even more alarming. The IRGC announced that it had laid underwater sea mines throughout the strait. That single claim sent insurance premiums for any vessel attempting to transit the waterway rising to extraordinary levels. No shipping company was willing to risk a vessel worth hundreds of millions of dollars on uncertain waters. What Iran had achieved was genuinely strategic. Without firing a single shot directly at American forces, it had turned a body of water into leverage. The strait had become Iran's most powerful bargaining chip, the one thing that guaranteed it a seat at any negotiating table. There's a particular kind of power that exists only as long as nobody tests it. Iran had built exactly that kind of power in the Strait of Hormuz. The warnings were loud. The language was firm. The world's shipping industry believed it. Oil markets believed it. For 6 weeks, that belief alone was enough to keep the strait effectively closed. But belief, no matter how widespread, has a weakness. It collapses the moment someone decides to find out whether it is real. Just 2 days before the American destroyers made their move, Iran's deputy foreign minister sat down for a public interview. He stated clearly that the strait remained under technical restriction. He described it as a very narrow waterway sitting inside Iranian territorial waters and insisted that all vessels wishing to pass must first contact Iranian military authorities. He made sure to emphasize that these restrictions were directly connected to the wartime situation and that removing them would take considerable time. Iran's message to the world was simple. The strait was theirs. Nobody passed without permission. But behind that confident public posture, something had gone quietly and seriously wrong. According to reporting from the New York Times, Iran was facing a problem it could not admit openly. The mines it had placed inside the strait could not be located. Iran, it appeared, could not find its own weapons. Whether this happened because the mines were laid in haste without proper mapping, or because the individual responsible for tracking their positions was killed when American strikes destroyed key IRGC infrastructure, the result was the same. The mine threat that had paralyzed global shipping was far more chaotic and uncontrolled than Iran had been letting on. Yet publicly, the warnings continued. Iran kept insisting the danger was real, and for a time that insistence held the world in place. Then April 11th arrived. On that morning, the USS Frank E. Peterson and the USS Michael Murphy, two Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers among the most capable warships currently operating anywhere in the world, entered the Strait of Hormuz. Their transponders were on. Their course was steady. U.S. Central Command confirmed the transit publicly and without hesitation. Admiral Brad Cooper issued a statement that carried the full weight of institutional confidence behind it. He announced that American forces had begun the process of establishing a new passage and that the pathway would soon be shared with the global maritime industry to encourage the free flow of commerce. Iran's state media responded by claiming the ships had reversed course. One outlet reported that the Iranian Navy had issued a warning that forced the Americans to turn back. But three separate Western publications confirmed the full transit. Satellite tracking data and the vessel's own transponder signals documented the entire multi-hour journey, from east to west and back out again. The ships had passed. Iran had watched, and Iran had done nothing. The mine-clearing operation that followed was already in motion. The USS Pioneer and USS Chief, Avenger-class minesweepers based in Japan, were spotted heading toward the Middle East on the same day. Unmanned underwater vehicles were being deployed to hunt whatever mines remained. And President Trump confirmed on Truth Social that all 28 of Iran's mine-dropper boats were, in his words, lying at the bottom of the sea. Whatever mines existed in the water were all Iran had left. It could not add more. The Bluff had not just been called, it had been dismantled. Somewhere between the warships moving through the strait and the minesweepers preparing to follow, a different kind of battle was being fought. Not with destroyers or underwater vehicles, not with satellite tracking or naval blockades. This battle was being fought inside a conference room in Islamabad, Pakistan. And in many ways, what happened inside that room was just as consequential as anything happening on the water. The scale of what assembled in Pakistan's capital on April 11th had no real precedent in modern diplomatic history between these two nations. The American delegation numbered approximately 300 people. Vice President J.D. Vance led the team. Alongside him stood Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, Presidential Advisor Jared Kushner, National Security Advisor Andrew Baker, and a full team of specialists covering nuclear issues, economic sanctions, military affairs, and regional security. The composition of that delegation sent a message before a single word was spoken. The United States had arrived prepared to negotiate everything, simultaneously and seriously. The Iranian delegation numbered roughly 70 members. It was led by Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, a former senior IRGC commander known for some of the most hardline nationalist positions of the entire war. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was present alongside economic experts, diplomatic officials, and critically, a direct representative of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps itself. The people who actually control Iran's military infrastructure and nuclear program were sitting at that table. Whatever came out of that room, it could not later be dismissed as the work of diplomats who lacked real authority. But before the two sides even sat down together, Iran had attempted to pre-shape the outcome. In the days leading up to the talks, Iranian officials publicly declared two preconditions for their participation. First, a ceasefire in Lebanon, where Israeli forces had been conducting sustained strikes against Hezbollah. Second, the release of billions of dollars in Iranian frozen assets that had been held under international sanctions. Iranian officials stated plainly that if those two conditions were not met, their delegation would not travel to Pakistan at all. Neither condition was met, not partially, not symbolically, not even gesturally. In the 24 hours surrounding the Islamabad talks, Israeli forces struck over 200 Hezbollah targets in southern Lebanon. U.S. officials confirmed that no frozen Iranian funds had been released and that none would be released as a precondition for talks. Iran's delegation boarded their plane anyway. They arrived in Islamabad before the American aircraft had even landed. 21 hours of negotiations followed. When they ended, there was no agreement. The core gaps remained precisely where they had been. The United States demanded a full freeze on uranium enrichment, the surrender of Iran's existing stockpile of highly enriched uranium, and long-term verifiable restrictions stretching across decades. Iran refused to accept the complete dismantlement of its nuclear program. Its foreign minister told media afterward that the two sides had come inches away from a deal before the goalposts shifted. American officials did not confirm that framing. On the Strait of Hormuz itself, Iran attempted something that Vance described as moving the goalposts mid-negotiation. Iranian sources floated the idea of collecting transit tolls from vessels passing through the strait as compensation for war damages. The United States called that proposal a non-starter without hesitation. When Vance departed Islamabad in the early hours of April 12th, he stood before reporters and delivered a single sentence that defined the entire American position. We have all the cards. Within hours, President Trump announced a full naval blockade of Iran, effective April 14th. While diplomats were still packing their bags in Islamabad, American intelligence agencies were quietly tracking something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with negotiating tables or ceasefire deadlines. Something that, if confirmed, had the potential to fundamentally change the entire military equation should the ceasefire collapse. On April 11th, CNN broke the story, citing 3 separate people familiar with recent intelligence assessments. China was preparing to deliver new air defense systems to Iran, and it was planning to do so within weeks. The specific systems under discussion were not conventional radar-guided missile batteries. They were man-portable air defense systems, commonly known as man-pads. These are shoulder-fired, infrared-guided missiles, small enough for a single soldier to carry, conceal inside a civilian vehicle, and deploy within seconds against a low-flying aircraft. According to intelligence assessments cited by CNN and the New York Times, Beijing was planning to route these shipments through third countries, specifically to mask their Chinese origin. Defense analysts suggested the systems may include the FN-6, one of China's most advanced export-oriented manpads, capable of engaging targets from as low as 15 meters above the ground. To understand why this mattered so much, one must understand what American air operations over Iran had been built upon. 6 weeks of sustained strikes had severely degraded Iran's large-scale radar-guided surface-to-air missile systems. That degradation was real and widely acknowledged by military observers. But destroying fixed radar installations does not neutralize a single soldier standing on a hillside with a heat-seeking missile resting on his shoulder. It does not neutralize 500 fighters dispersed across mountainous terrain, each carrying a weapon small enough to fit inside a backpack. That is a completely different problem, and the United States already had proof of exactly how dangerous that problem was. On April 7th, President Trump confirmed publicly that an F-15E Strike Eagle had been lost over Iran on April 3rd. The first American fighter jet lost in the conflict had not been brought down by a sophisticated radar-guided battery. It had been hit by a handheld shoulder-fired missile, likely operated by a single individual. That single confirmed incident carried enormous implications. Now those implications were multiplied by the prospect of China quietly flooding Iran with hundreds of identical systems during a ceasefire that Iran was already using, in the intelligence community's own words, to replenish certain weapon systems with the help of key foreign partners. Trump's response when questioned about the intelligence assessment was direct. He warned that China would face serious consequences if the transfer proceeded. His administration had already placed a 50% tariff threat on any country supplying military equipment to Iran. The Chinese embassy in Washington called the assessment untrue and baseless, but U.S. intelligence agencies told CNN that Chinese companies had been consistently supplying Iran with sanctioned dual-use technology throughout the conflict. The manpad delivery, if confirmed, would represent the first known transfer of complete battlefield-ready weapon systems rather than individual components. And according to the New York Times, at least one shipment may have already arrived. With the ceasefire set to expire on April 21st, 3 distinct paths lay ahead. In the first, mediators from Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey succeed in bridging the remaining gaps. Iran agrees to an interim freeze on uranium enrichment. The strait reopens fully. The blockade lifts. Energy markets stabilize, and a longer-term framework begins. In the second, the deadline passes without agreement. Strikes resume against refineries, power grids, and economic infrastructure. Iran retaliates. The second phase of the conflict begins, longer and costlier than the first. In the third, the accumulated weight of destroyed mine-dropper boats, an active naval blockade, 230 trapped oil tankers, and a shattered air defense network forces Iran toward a partial capitulation. A limited deal is struck, not comprehensive, but enough to serve as the foundation for something more permanent. Iran entered these negotiations weaker than it had been in a generation. Its supreme leader was gone, its air defenses were degraded, its proxy network was fracturing, and 2 American destroyers had sailed through a waterway its own deputy foreign minister had declared closed. The question was no longer whether Iran had leverage. The question was whether it had enough left to matter. The clock was running, the strait was being cleared, the blockade was active, and somewhere in transit, a Chinese weapons shipment was either already moving or being watched. The next 10 days would determine the answer.